Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's been a heavy week. I think we're in store for some more of those. But as it is, let's turn our attention to part 2 of our reading of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, Chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists. David, is there anything you want to say up top about this chapter? We're dealing with some sticky issues, including gender and nationalism. Important chapter.
I think a lot of it will reveal itself as we get into the text. Just remind people, if you missed part 1, very worthwhile to watch that first, just so you're up to date. But the first bit of the Communist Manifesto is sort of laying out in a rough draft of Marx's, theory of history, basically, and recognizing not just the role that class plays in politics and in history, but particularly like the progressive role of the bourgeoisie in defeating feudalism. And I bring that up, one, because I think that's an important thing for people to know, but two, this becomes really important, I think, in the context of what he's going to be sketching out, and him and Engels are going to be sketching out in this chapter. Which is recognizing the tremendously progressive and revolutionary character of the working class movement, and being able to like hold the arguments about the bourgeoisie that he sort of lays out in the first chapter in concert with these, I think, is sort of important to get at what he's laying out here.
Yeah, and so I think we're going to try to go for this line by line here. So I'll begin our narration. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from other working class parties by this only: 1, to bring the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries. Hold on, let me retake that again. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. And 2, in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. So yeah, I mean, what does he mean by sectarian here, David?
What I think Marx is getting at in this bit here is something that we maybe use in a different kind of phrase on this program, a term that we borrowed from others, which is like being class rooted versus like just being class focused. What he means by this is, what he's getting at here is that this communist movement, the communists, are rooted within the working class, not just in the sense of like it has its loyalties, right, which it already does, but in it as it actually exists in the present. So understanding what the role of a communist movement, right, which sees like this far-reaching horizon for a different world and a better society, but is also like acting in the present time, means that when you're going to be building up these kind of movements and struggles, you're participating in the active struggles of working people to better their lives today, while sort of nudging them to that kind of future horizon. And I think that where you really see this, for example, that nudge, right? Because a lot of people hear that and they might not know what it means. That nudge is very clear, I think, in the context of the national question. Because if you know anything about the history of the 19th century, it's a big struggle around the question of nation formation, and national struggles and national conflict. So what you're seeing is like, okay, you're participating in, helping out the working class movement in Germany or in France or in England. But instead of just sort of being, centered only around your personal national struggle, recognizing that there's like this united global international class. So that's how you're able to sort of push these things forward, right? So yes, you might be taking on like your own national bourgeoisie, right? The people who own the industry in your country. But you're also talking about your German and French and American comrades, and building that sense of internationalism, right? And this is like an early tenet of the socialist movement, one that's really important, frankly, is this international solidarity and international conception, because it actually lays the groundwork for what is supposed to be a global and international movement of working people against a global and international system of exploitation that is capitalism. And I know this next section here, I think, really breaks down this tension very well, I think.
Yeah, the communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat.
So I think that this, like, I mean, this highlights a line that, like, I borrow a lot from Sam Gindin, one, you know, an incredible theoretician and somebody who did a lot of work with Leo Panitch. About like this kind of timidness you sometimes get in like the North American socialist movement, of sort of advocating for certain perspectives, sort of advocating that struggle sort of directs itself in a certain way. Because people are like, oh, I don't want to speak for the movement, or I don't want to even push the movement. And in fact, you know, Gindin says like, well, no, like the socialists, one, are like in the working class, right? As in general. You, of course, have class traders, people like Engels and people like Lenin even. But, you know, as a general population, most socialists are in the working class. And this kind of timidness that comes, well, because, you know, the working class doesn't necessarily have like a revolutionary consciousness yet, or even like a full class consciousness yet. The role of socialists is to sort of be quiet, and to just sort of be, you know, helpful foot soldiers in that movement is incorrect. Now, as Marx is laying, because there's a tension here, right? Because there's two things that are being advocated at once in this Marx conception, is like this non-sectarianism, right? This kind of like, oh, well, we're communists and we believe in like the final this, and that. Therefore, if anyone sort of breaks from us, we're going to like destroy them within our own movement, right? Saying that's not helpful. But also that like, no, these are people who are seeing the struggle. So the fight for sort of work week. And being able to advocate and fight within those struggles, but also be pushing. It's like, yes, and why are we advocating for shorter work week? Well, one, because, you know, we want more time for ourselves in our life, but also this gets at the heart of the wage labor struggle in society that keeps us all down, right? So it's being able to do these two things practically at once, which is being like rooted and competent and involved in these movements, but also sort of advocating and agitating to see these real organic struggles that are happening within the working class movements, and to continue to push those in an even more revolutionary, radical way is the kind of the role of the communist movement, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, in China Mayville, he has a book out called The Spectre Haunting. And just to comment on when Marx uses the word parties, Marx and Engels proposed relations between the communists and the working class and its parties, and then in parentheses he writes, representative organizations in a wider sense than that term would mean today, including, for example, trade unions, the Chartists, as well as looser political tendencies, to stake out a position as the best grouping to achieve proletarian power. They repudiate sectarianism, insisting communist struggle as part of the working class movement, whether or not the wider class agrees with their specific positions. The communists, the most advanced and resolute section of the working class activism, with a rigorous historical understanding born out of class struggle, aim to overthrow. Yeah, and you know that, I mean, that's why he, like you mentioned the first section, he starts with that historical understanding of your position in the world, which is like, I mean, that's like existentially like the most important lesson of like maybe the past 300 years, right? Like where are you thrown, regardless of how you're thrown into this earth, where are you thrown on that question of class struggle, especially under capitalism, is and getting the working class in all nations to understand that as, you know, what needs to guide their action.
Yes, and like this is where in this next section ahead of us, which I'll just sort of paraphrase if that's all right, Matt.
Yep.
That he says like the theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on the ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change, consequent upon the change in historical conditions. And this is like, again, like a really key aspect of Marxist thought and what he's laying out here, that I think could be easily missed by folks. That what he's saying here is it's not just like, well, somebody thunk it. And therefore, like, there's now like an opportunity for socialist movement. In fact, in the next chapter, which we'll be getting into in a later episode, he sort of talks about people like these utopian socialists who might have had some even correct criticisms of capitalism, but they weren't rooted or reflective of the actual ongoing struggles. So what this is getting at is that communists can be personally inspired by their morals or their ideas and things like that, but the communist movement itself is actually like a real expression of real struggles that are happening in society, which means that if you have a kind of set of an abstracted kind of roadmap for how to build this movement, you will always fail, because it has to be reflective of the unique conditions wherever it is that you're operating in. Right. And this is always something that Marx gets accused of. It's like, oh, there's not really like this like fully fleshed out roadmap for revolutionary tactics and strategy for building a movement. And there's sketches of it here. But really what this is a plea for is like, are you rooting yourself in your contemporary moment and movement and struggles, seeing where these kind of revolutionary fractures and openings are for our movement and, taking advantage of those? Or are you just sort of pontificating about, ideas about how you would like the world to be? And that is like a kind of mistake that I think Marx is sort of trying to warn people from falling into there.
And so now he moves into this interesting sort of second person perspective, meaning he's addressing the reader itself, and the reader is sort of a bourgeois reader, right? That's making accusations toward the communists. It goes, all property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms and the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personal let me take that again. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. Now, this point is one I always think of when I hear all these Silicon Valley investors that have side hustles as podcasters glorifying the wondrous age we have of startups. And if you actually look at the data, that new business startups are at an all-time low. They've been cratering basically since the 70s. That all of that is basically a mask. It's marketing towards other investors to try to get them to invest in new companies by their Silicon Valley sort of like groups. And at the exact same moment when the entire economy is being hollowed out from that small sort of what even now we have, like he was looking back at a different type of nostalgia. We're looking back at like, oh yeah, imagine the mom and pop gas station, and now it's all, BP, right? And yeah, like that stuff, it sucks that that's going away. If we want to participate participate in that type of uncritical nostalgia. But ultimately, it's not the communists that are doing away with it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a pretty phenomenal point here, is that like the favorite metaphor is, you know, some hardworking guy who gets up early in the morning and, you know, builds chairs or something like that. The communists are trying to destroy that because they're really pissed off at this guy. The communists, I say, will say then and today, as long as they know what they're talking about, do not give a shit, frankly, about like the labor that you do and own, you know, for yourself in like small time home individual production. What they're talking about is the social power of capitalists, in fact, to live under the principle, which is you work, I take, right? Which is like the system of private property that we have today, that I don't want to spoil too much because he lays it out pretty well here. But I do think that like that's a distinction that, man, I think a lot of well-meaning young socialists in particular sort of get really like worked up on and tripped up on when they're having those little dorm room debates with a libertarian friend or something like that.
Right.
And it's very helpful for Marx to just say, like, we're not interested in that at all. And, you know, it's one of those things where, like, if, you know, having a conversation with an ideologue on that is going to be difficult. But you just sort of have to hold strong on it because, again, what Marx is saying, too, is it's not just like when he's talking about bourgeois private property, he's talking about a very specific thing that's being owned in a very specific way of how that ownership is being maintained. Not, for example, your toothbrush or your television, which is another classic thing, is that people want to come after your personal property, right? Which are things that you use and consume for, you know, life, for pleasure, for whatnot. Not, again, to exploit the labor of somebody else. That is something like a factory where, because somebody owns it, then they get to appropriate the labor of all these other people who are actually working. That's the property relationship that we're talking about here.
Yeah. And these, it's amazing to me how salient these objections remain and why it's so important that Marx addresses them. Because we have what about, you know, my PlayStation? Are you going to take that away? And then, and now, and it's like, no, we're mainly coming off private property. And then now it's, or do you, and we'll talk about individuality. Or do you mean the modern bourgeois private property? And the response is, but does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e. that kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism.
So I want to get there, but just like, let's flesh that out just really briefly. Because it gets back to the artisan thing. What does he mean by, when he says, does labor create any property for the laborer? This is, again, this is why, like, you can get really tripped up if you start talking about, you know, a bunch of other things here. So what is Marx saying here? Well, he's saying that, you know, again, going back to the artisan production, one of the things most people understand, if I work and I go in my shed and I build a chair, and I work on it for however long it takes me to do it, probably take me a long time to build a chair, right? What comes at the end of it? Oh, some property, right? A commodity, this chair. Who owns it? I do. It's mine. I labored on it. I worked on it. Now, if I want to turn that into capital, right? In essence, money, what would I need to do? I need to sell it, right? And then I would, whatever price I was to get for it, I would appropriate that money for myself and do whatever I want with it. Wage labor is different. If you work for somebody who owns like the chair factory, and you spend however long it takes you to make that chair, you don't create a new property for yourself. Somebody else takes that property, the owner takes that property and then sells it to somebody else. And then they exchange that commodity for capital. And then that person who now has this capital from the labor, you know, from the process of wage labor, from the creation of this chair, they take that, they pay themselves a significant amount of it, and they might give you a pittance of a wage. So the property, you're not creating any property for yourself working under the wage labor system. You're creating property for somebody else. And this gets to this fundamental tension, which is why those stupid ass conversations about PlayStations and toothbrushes or whatever the hell, I think some of them, a lot of them come from pure ignorance, but I also think that there's a point in obscuring it. So then you start having a really silly conversation about what things you put in your home, versus what we're really talking about, which is like the wage labor system, where somebody who doesn't work gets the benefit of the labor that you're doing.
Yeah. And I just want to sidebar in like our whole hustle culture thing of like, what is the like Patrick Bet David view of getting ahead? It's like you basically find a way to serve a capitalist and get enough from that compensation to put away to become a sort of rentier of your own. Mm-hmm. But like, of course, that can only be done because of you're competing with other wage workers. If you because if you like say, I want enough to not only pay my rent, but also put away toward a future business where I buy properties and flip them, right? Well, somebody else is going to say, I'll do that same job, but without that extra compensation. So, and that's how, right. So you're constantly being undercut by that. So this system fundamentally, that whole dream of, because otherwise it's like, well, don't have a family, don't go out, don't spend it on this, don't spend any sort of, this is how you do everything for free. Use these AI tools, right? And you can do all this work and get around it. But that's fundamentally not possible. It's just a lie told to workers as like, because people that are capitalists ultimately born into it or have been preferred by the state, or sorts of like the sort of idea that the general wage worker can become this sort of person who's living off of owning. Again, that's not how an economy works.
And like, I think it's really perverse in America because we have this kind of historical model that is like very attractive to a lot of people called free labor, right? And free labor was certainly radical obviously in its opposition to slave labor. But the free labor system was, the idea of like the perfect like Northeastern kind of pre-capitalist to like transition to capitalism, of like the guy who works at the soap factory and he works there for 10, 15 years until he can put away enough of his wages to maybe buy factory is even the wrong word, like the soap shop, right? From the guy who owned it. And then they get to be, the boss and get all this money from it. And then they hire an apprentice, right? And this was the kind of American dream of free labor, which again had to also have the potential expansion of the West. Because eventually those conditions that allow that to exist for maybe a generation or a period of time, they start to dissipate as you have more and more concentration. But even the fundamental kind of contradiction or unique aspect about America is like this westward expansion, sort of like alleviating those tensions in early American history. They eventually just get eradicated fully once industrial production starts up in full. Because even when you still had, for example, like, California, I mean, people, we know it as what it is today, but like even in Lenin's time, California hadn't even been fully like incorporated into the capitalist system, right? There was still a lot of free land out there, we all know the history there, but the ability to sort of push the contradictions of capitalism westward. Well, eventually that small scale production just completely gets destroyed by centralized industrial production, so that you just can't make enough money being an artisan soap maker on any kind of real scale to compete with those industries. So that's also what Marx is saying about how like this private artisan capital, production is just being eradicated by capitalism because they literally can't compete with the price and scale of these kind of industries. So like, again, like these kind of things is like, these are old school views of even like how a capitalist system worked that are completely antiquated. And they very like at the height of when free labor was being advocated for by like Lincoln, you had barely a generation that was going to be able to experience that before it was all going to be big time, big boss capitalism.
Well, and one of the calls they make is, nationalization of the modes of transportation. And that is, of course, like one of the main complaints we would later see of the farmer populist movements, which is like, yeah, I supposedly am this capitalist on my own land, and I am completely at the mercy of the rail and grain elevators, and my wife can't buy clothes. So let's continue. Actually, I've realized the sort of rant I went on was sort of taken directly from this next section. To be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society, can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not only personal, it is a social power. When
Let's
therefore
capital is therefore not only personal, it is a social power. I think that really gets at the height of this. The idea that, again, this is why like so many of like the bourgeois economists, they talk about man as like an isolated being from society, and Marx's like real intervention was like, hey, let's take this fucking idea that you're talking about and like actually place it in the world instead of just something that exists in our heads, and investigate how it operates. I just think that bringing these things from, to use flowery language, right, from heaven, from the earth to heaven versus from heaven to the earth is like a great contribution here of Marxist thought.
Right, because it's like the like classic like liberal apologist thought experiment is like, oh, everybody on an individual level is both a capitalist and a worker. Imagine if you were on an island and you could plant corn on that island or something shit like that, right? But it's like, that's nice. That's cool, and we can all understand our capabilities here. But also in the world, capitalists are arrayed against workers. That's just like how it is. And we need to, like deal with that as opposed to like this deserted island. When therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses class character. Let us now take. What were you gonna say?
I was just saying we sort of tackled a good bit of
it. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e. that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. Like I said, it's not really going to help you become a capitalist of your own right and secure like that lump sum you need. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it.
Yeah, and this is the principle of capitalism in America and all over the globe, right? It's like you work, I take, and that is like the fun. Like people, sometimes this is like the language gets people confused because sometimes the way that we talk about property, while certainly touching on a lot of these similar factors, like I think that sort of obscures in a kind of contemporary listener's mind what it is that we're talking about. We're talking about the appropriation of property via wage labor. Which is the engine of the system.
Mm-hmm. And, it's interesting. Peter Limbaugh, who I had on an early episode of this show, he has, I don't know if it's Red Round Globe Hot Burning or in the Many-Headed Hydra, but he talks about how like these sort of giant corporate, sort of early capitalist organizations, the way that they would allow workers, like, so you're a tobacco merchant, right? And you have all these people making barrels for you, doing all this different stuff. Part of the way you keep a pliant labor force is, you can take some of that tobacco home, especially in the early years. And Limbaugh tracks over the course of that. Well, now it's time to tighten our belts, and now all of a sudden we have to institute a policy where the workers aren't allowed to do that. But that was only made possible by the early stages where you're letting people work for you because you give them these goodies, while you're still taking their surplus value and making your power greater and greater until the point you can say, no, if you take some of that home, you're fired, you're fucked. And, it's just interesting how that power, that, like you say, is social power. And it is accumulating unless we address it and abolish it. Let's see here. Where did we leave off? In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, I mean, this is another thing. We look at corporations putting profits towards stock buybacks instead of like worker benefits. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. I think this is such a direct address to like, even like the post New Deal Reagan era, like you don't want to live under the, the Soviet bloc and not be able to do art. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom. And rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling, and free buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all the other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying with the unfettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and of the bourgeoisie itself.
And
now,
again,
what does he mean by the abolition of buying and selling?
Well, I mean, what he's talking about here is that the entire system that we have right now is like producing things to be sold at market, but a particular market, a capitalist market. And the logic of that capitalist market is that somebody who owns the means of production is able to appropriate other people's labor, utilize that market to realize profit from the selling of the labor of the commodities produced by the labor of others. And he's saying, yeah, I want to abolish that. So when you're talking about these kind of flowery words of like freedom and all this kind of stuff, it's like, well, what freedom is it that you're talking about? Because, what he's saying right now is like, again, this idea that what the communists are advocating for is a kind of perpetual prohibition on you being able to access goods and services and things is incorrect. What he is talking about abolishing is the present conditions of labor and the appropriation of the labor of others to benefit the capitalist class. So this talk of free buying and free trade and free selling, it doesn't make any sense under a communist system where people are owning the labor, own their own labor, own what they produce, and then are able to exchange those things on a social basis. Something very different from this is like a tension that we get into sometimes, where it's like the products that get produced under capitalism are secondary to capital. And what do I mean by that? The fact that you own a factory that produces T-shirts means nothing to you at the end of the day, right? The social use of those goods and all that kind of stuff, right? The need in society for those kind of things. What it is it's a way for you to realize a return on your ownership of a thing. So if it's a T-shirt, if it's food, if it's oil, if it's guitars, whatever, doesn't matter at all. And communism and socialism flips that, so that we are working and producing things. So you're still working. People are still working, but they're owning what they produce. And we're producing them not for a realization of high profit, for a boss, but for our own benefit, right? So that we're producing things to society so that we can then take out from society, what we need. So this like free buying and selling, like under capitalist, conceptions is a kind of meaningless distinction, because the conditions that necessitate that would be eradicated under communism. Mm-hmm.
Also, like free selling the commodities that I have had my laborers produce.
Yes.
So when you really spell it out, it's not so impressive. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, it's just interesting how it goes to but in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property. The necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. And in that, you see why this Marx was mentioned a lot post great financial crisis and Occupy Wall Street with that, like sort of 99% sort of stuff.
Though notably, the 90 versus 99% also might sort of reveal a little bit of the character of some of those movies. Not that those are necessarily scientific numbers or anything like that, but there were some people who were included in the "we are the 99% that might not be the Marx.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's true. In one word, your approach is with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. This is Marx really getting in his bag here. From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent into a social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property into capital, from that moment you say individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois. That's such a great point. Then the middle class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made possible. And like, what's sad about that is like in our cultural inheritance from that time period, novels and stuff like that, you have to do a special search to look at representations of non-bourgeois. Like novels, I mean, Dickens will do some of lower classes, of course, but like so many of the novels are.
But they're novel for that. Sorry, I'm not trying to do a pun. Like they're unique because they have like a working class perspective in them in the first place.
Right. Precisely. Yeah, exactly. And like those are the vast majority. I mean, we'll get into like the talk about weddings and women and wives and stuff like that. But you hear about Jane Austen as these great romance novels, and you actually read them, and it's all about women looking at different possible dowries and suitors, and like, oh well, that guy has those lands, but he does get $100,000 a year, whereas like this guy, his estate isn't quite so impressive, but he's getting a lot of income from the colonies. Like that's what those novels are basically about. Yeah. So we'll continue. Jump in.
I just want to highlight one thing really fast, just in case somebody is unclear as to what we mean by like the abolishing of private property and the social power. Maybe by way of like metaphor for people who watch like our program might understand, like this is the way this is expressed in society. So we're dealing with a climate crisis. We need to change the way that we're producing things. We need to change what we're producing, how we're producing it, etc. Well, what is the kind of liberal bourgeois political world's response to this? Well, if we can incentivize private owners of capital to do this type of production, then maybe they will do it. Right. And that I think very like lays out very clearly the social power of capital, where we're saying society in the globe like needs this fundamental shift. But we are not willing to assail this like power of the bourgeoisie of the capitalist class in order to do so. So what we have to do is sort of beg and plead for capitalists to go in the benefit of society versus a socialist model. This would be, we would still be producing. I just want to get this really clear. So that one, like utopian people, aren't getting confused because there's all this like, oh, communism and socialism is when there's no work. No, there's going to be work. There's going to be a lot of work that will be needed to be done. Right. The exploitation, the barbarity of it, the degradation of the laborer, those will be challenged and will go away. But like a socialist model would be like, hey, like let's just say, hey, we're going to take over the big three auto companies, and we're putting the UAW workers in control of those factories, and we're going to build out EVs or something like that. We're going to build electric vehicles in those facilities. We're going to build them without the need to produce profit for a capitalist class. So we'll be able to do those affordably and rationally so that we can get them into as many people's driveways as possible. And we're just going to do this as a society. So again, the labor's still there. The physical machines and all those kind of things are still there. What we're talking about eradicating is the guy sitting behind the glass window, watching it and overseeing it. And then even worse, the guys living hundreds of miles away, just getting a check and influence and power over these kind of things. That's the social power that Marx is getting at, that socialists are getting at. This is an example of how class power like really rears its ugly head in social questions, right? Because I think one thing that I think the socialist movement has gotten better at in this country is talking about these things as on the level of democracy, is that people want to have a cleaner planet. People want to have nice things. And in fact, the people who are stopping us from doing that are the people who are saying, At any cost, you will never be able to touch my personal profit, my ability to be a lord over other people's lives. And the socialist movement is saying, no, we're challenging that directly. So I don't know. I hope that cleared that up if anyone was a little confused as to what we're getting at here.
Yeah. He says, you must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. It has been objected that that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease, and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology. There can no longer be any wage labor when there no longer any capital. When there no longer is any capital. All objections urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating material products have in the same way been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products. Just as to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is, for the enormous majority, a mere training to act as a machine. Right. I mean, and let's continue here, but don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. And so that's a pretty, I think, a statement that I think even most common sense people that don't consider themselves Marxist or to an extent, I think feel, and how they slot on partisan through a partisan lens is sort of independent of that. But people sort of accept that idea of those sorts of the sort of rich elite control of all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and like if people want some more examples of this, you can watch our Marx reading on the Young Hegelians, right? What was the text of that? The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, where we talk a lot about how the law is a reflection of like bourgeois property relations and things of that nature. So again, it's like, if you wanted to get like a quick distilled line of Marx and Marxism that wasn't just sort of like, he's a communist, or even what he was saying is like the abolition of private property. It's also just a demand. It's like, let's take these high-minded phrases about democracy and freedom and law and all this kind of stuff from a kind of abstracted, unclear, term, into what we actually are talking about in the real world. And it's kind of rootingness of these things in how they're actually expressed in society, in history, and in, contemporary times, versus again, these kind of abstract, and like, it's something that I rage against in general, right? We always have these abstract debates about things, where we're saying like, do you believe in nonviolence or violence as a principle? Or do you believe in electoralism or revolution, or all those kind of things, right? It's like, this is a way for us to have zero conversation, because instead of actually talking about the practical movement of human beings, we're talking about loaded signifiers, to use a fancy term, like loaded words.
We're looking at shadows on the cave wall.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, another favorite of people.
I don't know if I'm using that right, but
I think that's fair.
My shot. But yeah,
It's just, I'm sorry, just Plato is just like every dumb guy like reads that and they're like, you know what, this is about like the Matrix and how like, you know, people have been stopping me from eating enough meat or some bullshit like that.
No, it legit, like every media studies writer will mention the cave wall thing, and I went through grad school media studies and never really sure like how exactly to deploy that. But I'm not Marx is more my sort of software than platonic reasoning, but still it's like those ideas, and I think here he moves into we'll talk about the family stuff, but like those ideals, I think he's sort of like he's responding to attacks on communists by pointing out hypocrisy, and the hypocrisy toward those sorts of ideals, and the suggestion, I think, and we'll get into sort of the critique of a feminist critique of this here, and also maybe a apology for it a little bit too, but we'll just continue. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason, the social form springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition, Affubung, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, which is both like, I guess, how do you want to sidebar on what that term is, both a sort of abolition and transcendence of
basically
of like the what's essentially useful in that of the abolished form into a new form, sort of post-abolition.
Well, let's take just a second, just to introduce this next one, because we're going to talk about the family, right? Which is another one that people get, they were attacked for at the time. People still feel very strongly about. I will just say two things, and this is my personal opinion. I think that a lot of the left-wing stuff, contemporary left-wing conversations about this demand, are flat out wrong, and are like are like bizarre defenses of like the degradation of the social unit in general, but particularly of the family in contemporary capitalism, which Marx lays out in this text here, is how, you know, when we're talking about the family is not something that is even accessible for working people in his time. Right. But you see this, like, you know, Sophie Lewis, for example, is a writer who people really promote a lot. I find their vision of this to be pretty not just unattractive, dystopian, frankly. So when we're talking about this, I'd like to at least articulate a little bit more of the Marx and Engels version of this than maybe getting into those kind of debates about today. But I will just say as some notes, just historical notes. This is a lot of Engels influence as well. This is Engels's like passion. That doesn't mean that it's wrong necessarily, but I just think that, you know, when you're reading a text, you always sort of have to wonder, you know, who's pushing, especially a co-written text, who's pushing for what. And I think it's very clear that Engels was very passionate about this subject. But I don't need to, I guess, preface it too much. I just want to note that, because, like, I will say that, like, I don't think that running around today and like advocating for the quote abolishing of the family in 2023 is a really strong way to build and articulate our claim and our vision of the future. Particularly because I think a lot of people don't understand what it is that we're getting at. Right? They see like, well, the family is like one of the only like social units I have in my life. It's very important to me, and I agree. Same thing for me. But what they're talking about here is not that like ripping children away from their mother and father, right? But rather, what role does the family play in capitalist production, particularly in the walling off of a community people, the family, from the rest of society, right? This is where you see like, well, one family is doing better than the other, right? Because like we create these kind of private walls, wherein you can sort of create an island in and of yourself, to sort of shield maybe your immediate people around you. You know, a concept like generational wealth, for example, like gets into this. Whereas, like, some families are able to appropriate significant amounts of capital. They're able to shield themselves from some things. And like, there are people who aren't like ruling class folks, but are able to weather difficult situations better than maybe even their neighbors. And what we're talking about here is not, for example, that like, again, that's like a very rational thing to take care of your children and your immediate family in this horror world that we live under. But what they're getting at is that like nobody should sort of be condemned to a certain kind of life because of what family they were born into or what family they weren't born into. So like this kind of determining factor of life by the family that we have under capitalism erodes when your ability to get education, food, secure shelter, all those kind of things are socially provided. Then the family, instead of being the kind of perverse thing that we have right now as an economic unit, right, actually becomes like a community of loved ones able to exist on its own 2 feet in the human way that I think most of us, who have good relations with their family would like that to be, right? You want to be able to relate to your mother, to your wife, to your father, husband, children, cousins, etc., as a human being instead of as like an extension of economic power or economic opportunity. And that's the perversion of the family that they're sort of reacting to in large part here. But we can, jump.
Well, and no, I mean, that's exactly like, this is still an urgent problem. And when we talk about alienation and loneliness and stuff in society, it's because Ben Shapiro all of a sudden is on this alienated society, and it's because women enter the workforce or whatever left-wing shit he wants to complain about. But the real problem, and then what's his solution to climate change is just move. So I guess you can all just move, right? Like just uproot yourself and go anywhere the fuck else that is doable, right? And that's like so much of like, why am I in New York away from my family? It's because of the centralization of communications and education stuff in New York, right? And why do people like that grew up their whole lives here have family that are scattering towards like different cheaper places? It's because it's too expensive, and all these people getting pulled apart basically by the economics. So yeah, like the economics is an urgent issue when it comes to families, and ameliorating the sort of market driven approach to everything like that, which is like that's driving people apart, and it makes it hard to build any kind of connections, whether that's just familial, social, or romantic. Like, it's not surprised all these things are a problem at the exact same time. So yeah, Affabung of the family. Even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. And again, like, you can see this was such an urgent thing at that time too, as we were fixated on, oh, you want to share wives. And I think their response here, throw it back in their face, is very good. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. Again, what I mentioned about Jane Austen. What's so significant about that guy? Oh, he gets $100,000 a year from Jamaica. What's behind that? We don't need to really inquire too terribly much. But there's some troubles there. Anyway, in its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But, you say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And this is where they don't want to like rip your families apart and have everyone be a social mother and social father. But public education it's the 10th demand of their 10-point thing here. And it is something that we need to follow through. And I don't think it's exactly. I don't think it's a coincidence it's being attacked to this day. And so, end your education. Is it not also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools, etc.? The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do but seek to alter the character of that intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. And again, we see all these people act like they're critics of the Ivy League, but like that's what the Ivy League exists, as a ruling class finishing academy. And again, like that, there's a popular demand for that just needs to be sort of conditioned in the right way, and not like they're being woke and making us all fixate on racism too much. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parents and child, becomes all the more disgusting the more by the action of modern industry all the family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. I mean, we see... Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, again, like, rooting this also in what he's talking about here. So, like, what time period is he writing about? They're talking about children being brought into the workforce to produce, to get wages for their family unit. So this perversion that was happening under capitalism, he's basically saying, hey, it's pretty rich for a bunch of the bourgeoisie and capitalists in our society to be talking about, like, oh, this threat to the family that the communist and the socialist movement represents, because they want to do things like provide public education and end child labor and the whip that we use to force families to sell their children out and to another capitalist for work. We want to end that. Absolutely, we do. And it's disgusting for you to be defending this in the name of the family when in fact you're destroying the family and that relation because of this base economism that sort of was around at that time.
And we see the same tension now with the hysterical freakout that because schools want to include sex education and don't want to ban memoirs from gay people from their libraries, that they're trying to sexualize kids at the exact same time that all those public schools are being attacked, and we're passing laws loosening regulations on child labor. So, very apt.
And again, the reactionary need to control and lord over children, right? Out of the fear that if they are socialized and are meeting people, that they may no longer hold maybe bigoted views against other groups as you, is such an engine of the right attack on education. Oh, if my kids get educated in society, they might not hold these same kind of values as I do. And again, what Marx and the socialist movement is saying at this time, and I think still says today, is like, good. We are social beings and we need to live in society with one another. And the idea of sort of walling yourself off from society is a reactionary one. And it's, one thing that's unique, and that's good that we don't live under those same conditions today when it comes to education, but there's no doubt about it. There's a reason why conservatives have always been against public education, and they'll come up with a million reasons for it. But it's because of this.
Well, even people like Hillary Clinton being like, I don't want Donald Trump's kids getting free education. No, they should be forced into it. First, their parents should be forced into paying it, and they should be forced to go to school and sit in classes among people who are not wealthy. That should be compulsory, and we should desire a society like that. Absolutely.
So again, it's just knocking down the scarecrow of abolish the family. They're saying rip your family, and don't talk to your cousin anymore. No, what they're talking about is what is capitalism doing to the family? And yes, this attempt to oppose socialization of people is something we oppose. And I know we're about to get into women here. And I just have another historical note, but maybe I will wait till we introduce this.
Okay, let's get into this a little bit. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. And again, just say the utopian socialists, to be fair to the utopian socialists were kind of fixated a lot on sex and free love and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
But whatever. They wanted to everyone to have some fun or whatnot, but
look, they didn't look once from our perspective of understanding historical materialism and, the communist doctrine, we can understand, but they were shooting in the dark and, you might have came up with maybe we should all fuck each other too.
Exactly. Actually, keep going. I want to add in this stuff, but maybe I'll wait.
The bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. This is what's so funny because Yeah, again, like when I read Bismarck newspapers from the 1870s, they are obsessed with Mormons. And part of it is the sex stuff, but you also think of like, part of it is like jealousy of like, oh, I can't tell one woman to do the cooking and one woman to do the dishes. Like, the bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. And also like, have multiple kids. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common and naturally, can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed here is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. And here we see like, we'll get into like maybe the feminist critique, but also like, I think a lot of like people will credit him for that sort of, within that kernel there is a points towards like this being liberatory to women as well, despite some of the trappings of the time of women needing to be a protected class of people.
So maybe this is a good time to introduce like a kind of practical historical argument in here. And I think that this is like one thing that is, it's like a very notable thing about Marx and Engels sort of recognizing the role of women in production, right? What people will later call like social reproduction, right? This is like the bedrock of like socialist feminism, is that, you know, when you go back to the wage labor question, where workers are given only a pittance of the like the value of what they're producing in order to sustain themselves, that sustenance is also predicated on the exploitation of the family and of women in the family. Because there's a tremendous amount of work that goes on at home, from the, you know, caring of children to the household chores, to cooking and things like that, that is done unpaid by women historically. That is not a small part of this system. Like having that role, social role, be sort of pushed on people is a massive part of the of this, you know, what keeps the lights on under capitalism. So it's notable that Marx is talking about it there. I just wanted to add like two quick historical notes from the Soviet Union. A really great text, a speech by Lenin to read is Soviet Power and the Status of Women. And it's such a great speech in its fullness, but it's also notable because this is like 1919. And it's the second anniversary of the revolution. And Lenin's speaking, you know, before this, you know, the Congress here, and, you know, you're expecting a triumphant speech, and don't get me wrong, there's triumph in it, right? You know, they've done something unthinkable. They're building something completely new. And he just goes into this fucking like sermon about the role of women in the Soviet Union, and says, quote, there cannot be, nor is there, nor will there ever be real freedom as long as there's no freedom for women from the privileges which the law grants to men. And Lenin was very adamant about this rising in of women in the Soviet Union to break down the patriarchal role of society, and saying like, hey, you know, we've done some stuff, we're not done at all. There's a lot more in front of us. And it also brings up another, you know, story that I know from the Soviet Union, which is the postcard divorces. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Matt.
Basically, I mean, this is also revolutionary periods like making divorce easier, basically, right? Yeah.
So basically, like, you know, and you got to also remember what the social context of the Tsarist Russia was like. You know, if you were married, you were effectively property of your husband. So the Soviet Union, you know, refused to accept that kind of logic. And they had what was called postcard divorces, where if you wanted to divorce your husband, for example, you just wrote your name and your husband's name on a postcard, and you sent it into the central authority, and no fault divorce, done. You're no longer married.
Stephen Crowder is pissed.
I mean, I'm sure that, you know, the conservatives were furious about this. And the divorce rate obviously like skyrocketed in these early days of the Soviet Union, because all of these women who were, you know, sort of held down by their husbands, but also by society in the sense of like what the legal system was like in that country, were able to be free. And like just imagining all of those people who were liberated from the yoke of not just Tsarist Russia, but from the yoke of, you know, brutal and abusive husbands is an incredible fact. This, of course, gets pulled back under Stalin, and it's a really, I think, turning moment in in the Soviet Union's kind of promise to what it ended up becoming when these kind of radical interventions were sort of scaled back under that regime. But again, like just saying, like, you know, there are actual real historical examples of what we're talking about here too. And I don't know, saying that somebody can leave their husband if they no longer wish to be married to them, you know, like giving people the freedom to choose and have autonomy over themselves. If that's what you mean by abolition, like that doesn't sound very frightening to me, frankly.
Yeah, I apologize for folks who don't know who Jimmy Dore is, but I can't help imagining him being like, "Come on, Leia, why are you talking about women stuff for? It's the second anniversary."
Yeah, that's
bringing up that woke stuff. Focus on worker stuff. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeois at the community of women which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women, and it has existed from almost time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common, and thus at the most what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce in substitution for the hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. I think Mark's being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e. of prostitution, both public and private. And, you know, I want to bring in here, there's an essay in the Cambridge Companion to Marx, includes an essay by Joan Toronto, Hunting for Women, Haunted by Gender, the Rhetorical Limits of the Manifesto. It includes this paragraph here, along with, you know, a critique of, again, like a lot of feminist writers have said, the way women appear in this is as a class to basically be protected. But rhetorically, not only have Marx and Engels shown the bourgeoisie to be hypocritical and immoral, but they have also positioned themselves to be the defenders of women, from the lowly prostitute to the woman worker to the bourgeois wife. Prurient interests in the sexual practices of communists have been inverted into concerns for the safety and virtue of almost all other women in society. It was a progressive move for Marx and Engels not to condemn prostitutes, but this point is consistent with arguments that they have made elsewhere in their writings. Others were not so kindly disposed. Consider Proudhon. And if Proudhon comes up in any discussion of Marx, you know it's going to be like, what a fucking asshole. like he's like basically the asshole foil. Consider Proudhon, quote, why is it that, independent of economic and political causes that attach themselves to it, prostitution is incomparably greater in women than in men, Proudhon wrote. By 1848, prostitution was a titillating social program, not to be discussed in public, but already the subject of scientific study. Indeed, Sheila Rowbotham has argued that Europeans were obsessed with the question. A number of social reformers had begun to turn their attention to the problem. Marx and Engels had been, in previous writings, more sympathetic to the plight of prostitutes than most, echoing the line that we find in Principles that women who became prostitutes did not really have any alternatives before them. I don't know if a whole lot more needs to be said about that. Like, I think their idea that, like, this prostitution, like, they're not going to... I don't take this as a enforce the sort of complaint about prostitution to be anything other than the sort of general complaint about what you're forced into under a capitalist society in regards to wage laborers, right? And I don't think they're going to be like, oh, well, like once the revolution happens, women are going to have to be monogamous or not even like not trade sex. But like you can't trade it to become a capitalist and then subjugate wage laborers.
Well, I mean, I think even more so, like it's the conditions here too, where it's like, you know, the conditions of like, you know, selling yourself in any context. Right. Someone else out of deprivation. He's saying like those are eradicated under this system, right? So all the moral conversations about, you know, is this a pure thing or a good thing, like that becomes secondary because the conditions that create, you know, that system under our current context are eradicated.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a very like, honestly, very like typical Marx being Marx here is saying like, hey, here's a buzzy little fight that people are having about this or that. Also, like this actually will not matter at all on the other side.
And now we move into nationality, which is another area. And Yeah, I think maybe people dismiss Marx as being not seeing nationalism enough, but I think you can read this as like this is a manifesto, so he's optimistic that it can be overcome, but understands that it's a obstacle. So it's the communist. Go ahead.
No, I'm just I'm surprised by that, because in a lot of ways I feel like Marx is anticipating what the 20th century is going to lead to when it comes to nationalism and national question. Anyway.
Yeah, and like the China Mayville piece quotes a few people being like this section here, the communists are further approached with desire to abolish countries and nationality. And then this line, the working men have no country. People say, well, look at all these instances where workers have like chosen nationality over international solidarity, right? But I feel like Marx understood that was a possibility, and that's why it was a role of the communists to get people to understand that.
100%. And that's why, I would just reproach anyone who made that argument with that. I mean, I think very much he's saying, hey, this is like a pitfall that is very clearly trying to be used to break apart the working class from gaining class consciousness. And that's why, like, we're going to start all of these conversations of the Communist Manifesto with this discussion of nationality. But
right, precisely, yeah. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, and which it didn't do really anywhere. Since the political proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonism between peoples are daily more and more vanishing owing to the development of the bourgeoisie. And this is another part that they cite. To freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production, and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. And I think people also read into that, which is, I think, a overly emphasized and not super well historicized idea that Marx and Engels had forestalled the idea that revolution could come from a place like Russia, right? That it had to come from like England and Europe. And I think Marx was more ambivalent about that in later writings.
Well, I mean, at the end of the Communist Manifesto, he does say our attentions turn to Germany.
Fair enough,
it seems like it's coming. I think that he might not be able to get away from that charge as much, but I think that that's oftentimes overstated in a deterministic way. And more, right. I think Marx was 100% right that the conditions for like a proletariat movement were way stronger in Germany or in England than in Russia. I mean, like, this is Lenin's like theoretical work is all trying to deal with the fact as to why it is happening in Russia. Which is why he says, it's because it's the forces we're competing with right now are weaker and less entrenched than in other ones. And like, I don't think Marx's analysis, for example, that like Germany and England in particular seemed like very ripe for this is wrong. I mean, they had to build up a lot of really fucked up things had to happen in those countries to prevent those movements from being successful. I don't think you can fault Marx for being optimistic about those. No, I mean, and like this bit here, though, national differences and antagonism between peoples are daily more and more vanishing. And this is something that I think is really critical, is that like, contrary to the, idea that like communism is going to turn the world kind of dull and gray. It's capitalism that has, effectively, eradicated a lot of local cultures, and like unique aspects of life. You see this is like the corporatization of people's life. There's a really great architectural essay about the no place or the no space. I might be getting the term wrong. But it's just talking about like these coffee shops that you could walk into in Tokyo or in Brisbane, or in Jerusalem or London or New York, and they're the same. Right.
Right.
And
when me and my friends were in the UK like 10 years ago, we called McDonald's the embassy because it was basically like the same type of place.
Yeah. And like this is 100% true. It's like absolutely there are like unique cultural and historical differences between people, right? Mm-hmm. But the fundamental condition of capitalism is that it's able to just like eradicate those in a practical sense. Like you might wear different clothes or have different names for the overseer, things like that. But the model is similar. This is, and again, you also have to remember what 19th century Europe is like too. They're like, oh, the German spirit, or like the English work ethic, or like the French, mind, all this kind of stuff. He's like, yeah, not so fast.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like, this brings me back to like first time ever really reading Marx in college, and my sort of things being put in Marx to say, oh, he said this would happen and it hasn't happened yet. And I always be like, well, that seems like a good point, but also maybe not yet. Like the discussion that like the world market, because even in the case of NAFTA, right, you have a sort of like a greater divide ostensibly between peoples, and we're seeing that occur within racism. But if you actually look at like the labor movements, which have been decimated, they are beginning to like work and see these sorts of things as a problem. And it's and that's a dynamic that like maybe it just would take centuries as opposed to decades. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, unless you had anything else on the national question, in interest of time, I think we can sort of very briefly do the philosophy religion thing. Because like this is Marx just reaffirming Marx's point in general about these kind of differences. It mirrors very closely to what he's saying about the nation. But he says the charges against communism made from a religious, philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. I think we can follow his lead there and just read this really fast. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? And what he's getting there is that, people will be like, well, all of these, like, religion, Christianity, that's been around with us for so long because it has like this eternal truth. He's like, well, no, look at Christianity. The Christianity that is practiced today is very different from the Christianity that was practiced at the beginning of the church, not to mention the Christianity that was practiced 100 years ago. So these things are, rather than sort of guiding, more reflecting what is actually happening in the material and political world, is sort of as serious of a retort as you can give that. But maybe, so in fairness to him saying briefly, that's all that he wants to say about it. Do we want to get to the plan?
Yeah. So, just to summarize here, he says, we have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy. And I love that line, that win the battle of democracy. And however that's won, like, whatever fronts that sort of takes, that's ultimately what needs to happen is the working class, raised to the position of ruling class. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of the bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. And he goes, you want to comment on that?
Well, I'll just say I have to take my pot shot here. The proletariat organized as a ruling class to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. And just be nice if some people who consider themselves to be Marxists today just admitted the fact that they, who knows if they're right or wrong, but maybe just start to own the fact that they have a non-Marxist view of political strategy on these things. But let's not get too wrapped up in that. I
think we understand the point being made there. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. And again, in later prefaces, they say, like, look, that's not the Ten Commandments. These are negotiable by the movements of workers individually. But in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. Number one, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, which, by the way, Abe Lincoln would institute in America for the first time in the fight against the rebels, which more upon later. 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels, which is, I think that is just that is
well,
like,
let's so people don't misunderstand that immigrants with an E. So people trying to leave the country, these are capital controls effectively. Anyone who's rich trying to flee the socialist state of North Dakota would have their shit taken from them at the border, not allow them to take it with them.
And that's what I like about, like, and when we talk about like the inevitability of a violent confrontation is, to me, how it happened in America, which is you start to say things, even hint at possibilities of things like, oh, slavery. We're not going to do fugitive slave laws. And the capital concentrated against that is going to freak out and go to war. And at that point, I think, is when you put them down.
Or flee like the Confederados in Brazil.
Going to Brazil, right? Yeah. Okay, so 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So not just abolishing money. I thought we could just abolish money. And anyway, 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Of course, I mean, even what's his name? Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote a critique, a satire of utopian socialists in Brookdale Farm. But in The House of Seven Gables, there's a discussion of like, what do you think is the telegraph is going to mean for society? Is it going to lead to this utopia, right? And they say like, well, hopefully it doesn't get into the hands of the slave enslavers and stuff and financial powers. And guess what it did? Anyway. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. I mean, Kowalski's going to love that. 8, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of the populace over the country. And 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. And then just to conclude, final chapters here, or final paragraphs. When in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very powerful last bit here. I want to go back to some of those 10-point plans in a second, but I will just say that Jacques Derrida, who's somebody I'm not generally a big fan of, has a very bizarre book on Marxism called Spectres of Marx, which is not worth slogging through because it's basically just him like riffing on like the opening lines of Hamlet, or some lines from Hamlet, and the opening line of the Communist Manifesto, which is, if you've ever read Derrida, is very like par for the course for him. But he does have an insight in there. Anyway, the book's not worth reading, I have to say. But he does have this kind of conception of Marxism that I've always sort of liked, is that, you know, Marxism might be the only, quote, suicidal philosophy. And what he meant by that is that Marxism is probably the only philosophy that sort of seeks to make the conditions of its use disappear. And that's sort of what Marx is getting at here, right? Is the idea that, you know, the kind of political nature of these fights, you know, eventually that will wither away. the political character here, and like the class dynamic of society will wither away as well, as this work of like fighting and producing and living for the collective and common good merge. The distinction between bourgeois and proletariat ceases to be, and we can then actually live under like the bourgeois notion of like of equals, right? Not in the sense of like enforcing equality between people, in the sense of like you have different abilities, I have different abilities, but the fact that we can meet each other in public and in the social world as individuals and actually be an individual versus being sort of condemned to being a member of this or that class. And I've always loved that kind of vision.
Yeah, I mean, because like as we say, like what are the present models of so-called individuality that are being presented to us now? And under our current form of capitalism, like in my lifetime, it's like there's like a founder. I'm a founder, and it's like what you mean is like you were able to secure funding from venture capitalists and probably have some light on labor way to try to like corner some market or intellectual property, right? And that is so debased. That is such and that so many guys and like well-funded like leaders of like thought leaders looked to by like, Forbes or whatever for like what the future is going to bring are just are basically supplicants to investor financing. And like, that is nothing to sustain. That is something we can, and instead of like everyone, like you say, like actual individuality, which isn't predicated on, again, appealing to investors, or finding some way of like, of doing something done for less labor that you can sell to those same investors. Like that's what needs to be abolished.
Yes. And I mean, we got 3 and 4 coming up. So that's the end of chapter 2. Some of the points that I think become really clear in 1 through 10 of the kind of common program here, I think really start to express themselves well in conversation with some of the strategy that's laid out in part 3 in particular. But if you look at the way I would just say is like a general principle, you see these things as like, a heavy progressive tax, right? Is something that has been formulated and won by many different social movements and political movements around the world. Maybe not heavy, probably in the way that Marx is outlining here, but progressive or graduated income tax, those kind of ideas. Where does this become radical versus a reform, right? And I think this is sort of gets to what Marx is talking about at the very beginning of this chapter, is that these are done in the goal of weakening the power of the capitalist class. So a heavy progressive or graduated income tax means appropriating more capital from the capitalist class. So they have less social power, as we outlined earlier. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. I mean, boom, that's a massive one. The increase of production in society allows there to be more bounty for the many, and to have that be used by the vast majority of people. Again, there have been state investment projects in this country, in the United States. But what Marx is talking about is like using this as like a kind of springboard for class struggle, and also notably who's it's being done by. I think is also something to be very careful about, because like these things are being implemented by capitalists or people who want to maintain capitalism. You can even support and fight for them. But no, when you're not the one calling those shots, the attempt is to sort of placate versus to eradicate these kind of conditions. And last thing I'll say is, public schools, that's a radical idea, and I don't think people should ever forget it because it's normal. And also
that's in the manifesto.
That's the fucking manifesto.
It's like Aaron Brown, like that's in the Bible. And also like, there's going to be work in this society, and the kind of like bourgeois socialism that you see a lot of in this country, that communism or socialism is an attempt to basically allow us all to be children of the bourgeoisie effectively and spend time sitting in a cafe. That's not the socialist utopia. In fact, what it is there'll be work, but the alienated character of your work goes away.
the fact that your work is going to produce for society something that you're participating in and benefiting from versus going into the hands of a private capitalist. That's a market difference, a radical one. And being able to do unalienated labor, right? To labor for the benefit of all is something that we don't get as much, under contemporary conditions. So it's not saying that, life will be a droll kind of 14, 16-hour workday under socialism. It's saying something much better and much freer for people. But yeah, it's also not this kind of utopian, we're all just going to be libertines, drinking Prosecco and hanging around while some secret class does the work. And right. I think, a lot of liberalism, I think, and left liberalism falls into this kind of trap, I think, of being against even work ethic. No, having a strong work ethic is a socialist value. And I'll hold on to that, despite how unpopular it is to say those kind of things. But sorry, I think it's very clear from these historical texts that plays a big role. And it's something that should be valorized. Right. Building shit like the Hoover Dam. That's cool shit, dude. What the fuck, man? Let's do that. Exactly. We've got to be the people building amazing things and making food for people. And that's a, you can have a life of meaning that is foreclosed to us today. Yep. But yeah, look, that's chapter 2. There's a lot in there. I think that the breakdown of some of these struggles, sort of responding to a lot of the common criticisms that we get, putting those on their own 2 feet is helpful. Really looking forward to finishing up this with part 3 and 4, which will be a little bit shorter, so we might have a more holistic conversation included in that. Is there anything else we got to add? No, I don't. I think that'll just about do it. All right, friends. Well, patrons who've been supporting this show and this project, we really appreciate all of you so much. If you're maybe listening to this later and aren't a patron, we do try to make these things available and accessible to people as much as possible in the future, but that support really helps us do it. So please consider signing up at patreon.com/leftreckoning so we can do more of them in the future. And everyone have a good weekend, and we'll see you soon. Peace.